What is the role of North Americans in God's global mission? Are we still needed to go into the world and share the good news of Jesus Christ? Is that really the best use of time and resources? We're going to discuss this and more with today's guest, Dr. Ed Stetzer, Dean of the Talbot School of Theology. If you're a student, pastor, or church leader, we're going to be talking about the role of the church in helping to prepare and equip young adults to live into God's global mission. And we're also going to hear insights from Ed's personal journey as a young adult, trying to figure out his place and what God would have him do. These things could change your life on this episode of the Urbana Podcast. Welcome to the Urbana Podcast. This is the show where we empower Christian leaders on college campuses with the tools and strategies to help students address the challenges facing our world and advance the gospel's reach to the ends of the earth. Welcome to another episode of the Urbana Podcast. I'm Mark Matlock. I'm the Executive Director of Urbana 25, and I am joined today by my co-host, Phoebe Jeske, student at Wheaton College. Phoebe, how are you doing today?
Good, Mark. How are you?
Good. You ready to do another one of these?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, a lot of people may not know that much about Urbana. I thought before we get into Dr. Stetzer's interview, we might talk a little bit about just the experience of Urbana. Urbana started in 1946 at the University of Toronto, where several hundred students gathered together. And they were primarily there to answer three questions. One, what is God doing in the world right now? What is God speaking to us through his word and his spirit? And then third, what does God want us to do about it? And that's kind of what we program around at Urbana. It's not just bringing a bunch of speakers or whatever. It's really trying to capture a picture to share with the generation what God is doing in the world right now. You actually went to Urbana 22 with close to 100 fellow students at Wheaton.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how you experienced Urbana. I went in 1990, as we've talked about before, but talk a little bit about how those three questions kind of fleshed themselves out and you experienced them in 22.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was really interesting for me because I came in as a freshman, so I was just beginning to kind of ask those big questions about what I wanted to do with my life, how my specific calling and vocation fit in with God's global mission. The interesting thing about me was I think I was thinking about those questions on a very localized scale. I was thinking, primarily U.S. focused, and even more than that, had just come out of high school. And so I was really on this kind of isolated level coming out of COVID, had just kind of been through this experience that was very friends and family focused. And because of that, hadn't thought a lot about how my specific passions could serve the global church because I had just kind of gone through this really localized season. And because of that, I think I came in and just absolutely had my mind blown in a way that can really only happen when God's doing something special for you that is different from what I had experienced in the past. So yeah, I really loved the different seminars and tracks that I went to at Urbana. I'm studying computer science, so I went to a lot of the kind of tech as ministry and business as ministry focused seminars. And that was a really unique experience because I think it's the first time that I really remember this message sinking in that missions is not just going to a foreign field and talking to people. Like that is such a small part of actually what it looks like to live out the Great Commission on a global scale. And for that, we need software developers and we need web designers and we need healthcare workers and we need all of these different fields that me and my peers were interested in. So just kind of hearing about the diversity of the mission field and diversity of options, career-wise and skills-wise within that was really empowering and inspiring for me. So that I think is kind of what Urbana did for me, really just opened my eyes to different opportunities and options that I could consider for the future.
Urbana, in fact, we're actually going to focus on vocation as mission one afternoon in Urbana. this next year. That's going to be a theme that we explore. I think we're going to do an episode that focuses just on that as well. And so it's interesting to hear that was a real important interweaving of your experience there. Urbana happens in between Christmas and New Year, and it happens every 3 years. So it's kind of limited. It's not something you can say, oh, I'll go next year. It only happens every 3 years. And it's long, it's not just a concert. It's not a day-long retreat. It takes place over 4 days. It's a commitment, and we've designed it that way so it has time to soak in, so you have a chance to really process and explore. If there's a student listening and they're kind of going, I don't know, in between Christmas and New Year, that's a special time for me and my family, or I like to take that break off. What would you say to them if they're thinking that way?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is just Urbana was one of my favorite parts of college so far. And I was skeptical too. I feel like everyone's a little skeptical because you don't know what you're getting into really, because it only happens every 3 years. Most students only go once. And so all you've heard is just maybe some stories from other people that have been. And I remember getting on the bus and feeling the sense of like, is this really what I want to be doing right now? Like, do I want to spend a week in Indianapolis? Absolutely yes. My answer was absolutely yes.
And we're going to be in Phoenix this year, so at least it'll be warm, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Phoenix will be amazing. Just like the more desert climate there will be wonderful for us north dwellers like me. But yeah, I think just go for it. I think you're never really going to know what you're going to get out of Urbana until you go. And that's the beauty of it, is it means something different for each participant. But I think it's so worth it if you're exploring what the global church looks like, and just like you said, Mark, kind of learning about what is God doing now all around the world. Hearing those stories is so valuable, but also not just hearing those stories from a general sense, but from a specific, like, individual sense of what is God calling you to. Spend that 4 days like in intentional discernment. It's easy to sit on your couch at home and not think about the future. And there's something really beautiful about taking that time out of your schedule and going and hearing what God has for you. I think there's no better way to spend your break.
That's great. Yeah, I really encourage everybody to go. I mean, Phoebe, you're really lucky. I went once because I went I finished college 6 months after Urbana. So it was like, boom, I went to Urbana, said, Lord, I'll go anywhere you want me to go. And then when I finished college, it was Texas. That's where he sent me. I'd grown up in California. So yeah. So it was a cross-cultural experience for me. Yeah. But a lot of people think that Urbana is just about like trying to get you to be a missionary, and it's so much more than that. It really is. When I became the executive director, I probably had 100 people reach out to me and just say tell me their Urbana story, and how Urbana had kind of helped them set a direction for their life, or a way of living. For some, it was radical. It was a vocation shift. It was a calling to live in a different culture and to do cross-cultural ministry. But for a lot of the people, it was just like, it changed their priorities and kind of how they viewed what God was doing in the world. So it's kind of exciting. So I'm excited that you get to go twice. I'm jealous a little bit too. I would have liked to have had a chance to go a second time. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk to Dr. Stetzer here today. Ed has become a real friend over the years, and he's going to be leading a pastor and church leader track, because what we've realized is that if a student says, hey, I want to go, or I want to live into God's mission in this way, if they don't have a supporting church behind them, it makes it really challenging. So I think you're going to enjoy what Dr. Stetzer has to say. Joining me today is Dr. Ed Stetzer. He is the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology, and you're also the Scholar in Residence and Teaching Pastor at Mariners Church. as well. You and I have known each other for a long time. I'm just curious, share a little bit about, for those that may not know you personally, a lot of people do, but talk a little about your personal calling and the ministry that you've been involved in over the years.
Yeah, I probably would go and consider myself a church planter, maybe more than any other descriptor. Is Don and I moved to the inner city of Buffalo, New York, and when we were 21 years of age, to plant a church among the urban poor. To do that, we ended up selling almost all our possessions and just wanted to go knock on doors, tell people about Jesus, serve the hurting and the marginalized, and so that became our focus. I didn't have any money. My denomination turned me down for funding, so I became a bivocational church planter. I worked as a contractor and renovating houses, insulating houses, and that helped pay the bills. Other jobs as well, and that's kind of where we began. Planted churches in Buffalo, churches three churches in Erie, Pennsylvania, churches in Atlanta and Nashville, Atlanta area and Nashville. And so we, and along the way, I did education and I did some other training and became, I guess, a church planning organizational leader, and then eventually became the director of Lifeway Research, which probably is a key shifting point when I eventually became what's called the president of Lifeway Research. Served at Lifeway there for about a decade, then off to the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, where I served for 7 years. And just about 18 months ago, I took this new role, moved to the West Coast because the West Coast is the best coast. As you have seen, you're not quite to the West Coast with Urbana, but you're getting closer.
Getting closer.
Getting closer.
Getting west and warm. West and warm.
Exactly. It's west and warm. Beautiful, beautiful choice for that time of year. Yeah, so that's sort of our journey. Donna's my wife. I have 3 daughters who are awesome and amazing. My education largely focused on leadership. I did a DMin in leadership, pastoral leadership, and then a PhD in mission and missions. And so I'm excited about being a small part of this incredible Urbana legacy.
Yeah, and you and I think, first met when you were just taking on the role at Lifeway, and we were starting to intersect at some different events, and kind of just the friendships built as we've found ourselves in the same airports and back rooms and things like that over the years.
100 years ago.
It seems like it, yeah. It does seem that way.
But was that Lifeway? That had to be almost 20 years ago. So we've been friends a long time. Wow, I can't believe most people don't tolerate me that long, so that's great.
and I think I'm actually closer to you now than even when we started. So that's
there you go. That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
Well, you were the director of the Wheaton Billy Graham Center. Yeah. Tell a little bit about that and how it has been involved in missions and that background, because I think that's where I really got dialed into the work that you were doing, was through the efforts you were leading there to kind of engage people with the Great Commission work through church planning and other evangelistic opportunities.
Yeah, the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, of course, was founded by Billy and Ruth Graham. They were there at the beginning on the board. It's there's more than one organization that bears Billy Graham's name, which is sometimes confusing to people. So this is the largest, of course, is the BGEA. This would be a smaller one. There's a chair at a school in Birmingham, Stanford University. Anyway. So this is primarily the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center was primarily a convening place for conversations about evangelism and missions. And so I left Lifeway, and I'm pro Lifeway, but I left Lifeway because I wanted to focus more on the mission of God. And I'd done my PhD years earlier at Southern, and really just got a passion for the mission of God and what that means. And so when I was invited to go to Wheaton College, they were forming a new chair, the Billy Graham Distinguished Chair of Church Mission and Evangelism, had an endowed chair, and they wanted me to take that and to lead the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. I mean, in a lot of ways, it probably surprised some people. It was a pretty decent pay cut. It was a move to Chicagoland from Nashville, where if you know anything about the demographics right now, everyone's moving from Chicago to Nashville, not from Nashville to Chicago. But this is just what we felt the call of God on our life. And really, it was really a joy to just see the response. I mean, the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center was struggling when we came, been without a director for a few years. And I just think that American Christians, they respond, and our focus was primarily America, globally through our engagements in North America. Eventually, I became the Lausanne regional director for North America, and we kind of commingled that work with the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. And I'm just convinced that what North American Christians need is to be, like the writer of Hebrews says, provoke one another to love and good deeds. If we provoke one another towards the right love and good deeds, showing and sharing the love of Jesus locally and globally, I think people respond, and they did. And so it was a good 7 years there. I really enjoyed it. And the director who's there now recently sent me a note saying, you left the place better than you found it. And I guess that's the best you can ask for. And so it's continuing to do, Wheaton College Billy Graham Center continue to do its good work, even though I've had the privilege of stepping into a new role here at the Talbot School of Theology.
Yeah. So as we look at, thinking about just the history of Urbana, this event goes back to 1946 in Toronto, Canada. Several hundred college students get together. As you kind of have looked at history and the student movements, what's been your impression of Urbana? Where has your life intersected with it in the past?
Well, Urbana has been a shaper of missiological conversations for a long time. So, when you look at UT, and all kinds of people sort of gathered there. The first one, as you mentioned, was the University of Toronto, and the second one, of course, moved to the famous name place, University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. And so I mean,
And I'll
Jim
mention
Elliott,
right now that we are going to be in Phoenix again for people, so
yeah,
they don't show up in the wrong place.
that's true. It's a good point. We're going to be in Phoenix, but Jim Elliott, who I used to, my office at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center was about 100 feet from his journal. He is no fool, and talks about his missions column. So Jim Elliott went to the Urbana as a student, and the early slogan "From every campus to every country" was a powerful slogan, and so there's a lot of connections. Of course, Billy Graham was deeply connected to it. He spoke at the second Urbana, I think it was. So there's kind of a continuing theme. And again, a lot of connections to people that many people would know their names, people like A.W. Tozer. But it might, if college students listening don't know who Donald Barnhouse is or Harold Ockenga, but they were really significant gatherings that really push forward students into the mission. And I think that's kind of a key place. I would say that when you look at the history of missions, the mission leaders, they're speaking into or attending Urbana, and I think that's been a pretty consistent theme for generations.
Yeah, and what I've always loved about Urbana, I went in 1990 when I was a college student, and it was kind of like, hey, here's kind of the state of the world, and then what comes out of it is not so much what we want you to do, but really what is God calling you to do? Because I think when I look at like the 90s, Bible translation was a really huge focus. There's a real need to engage that. Now the models around Bible translation and the way that it's been strategically implemented, it's really changed. That's not something that people are really looking for North Americans to do. How have you seen just seasons of change in mission? And where do you think we are right now? Because there are some people that say, hey, for North Americans, missions is more of an information item. It's not something we really need to participate in.
Well, I think the Great Commission still is given to Christians in the West. So I think that's probably a miss if that's what people are thinking. I think that, over the years, missions fervor has waned. And, it's gone up and down over time. And so I would say if you were to look back to the 60s or the 50s, you would see a higher fervor for missions that were sort of evident in the lives of many Christians. And when you see, Urbana was probably 3,000 or 4,000 people in the 50s. And then you come look at the 60s and the 70s. Urbana explodes in attendance because people are really intrigued and interested. Well, I think the reality is that we've sort of, when a few years ago, there was a young man who wanted to be a missionary to people in the protected waters off some protected islands outside of India. John Chow was his name, and people can debate John Chow's approach. I did, for that matter, but it was interesting because the early newspaper, this was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. John Chow tries to encounter this isolated tribe, and they kill him when he tries to encounter them. And, early on, everyone said how bad John Chow was. And, and again, people can debate that. But what we found out over time, well, first of all, the people weren't that weren't an uncontacted people. It actually been contacted. It's just a few decades before, and much more so in prior decades. But they didn't want to be contacted. So, but also, people were mad at Chow because, well, what did he do? What did he understand? But then they found out, well, he did EMT training and he did linguistic training, and he prepared a lot more than people thought. So eventually, after all the biggest headlines had sort of passed and this information came out, I wrote an article in the Washington Post. And it was actually, it's the most read article I've ever written on missions in the Washington Post. So, and, the headline, authors don't pick the headline, but the headline said, something like John Chow prepared more than we thought, but our missionaries still fools. And, I didn't mind the headline. It fit the article because my point in the article was that, the world thinks John Chow is a fool. But what a different world it is from when Jim Elliott, Urbana attender,
Right.
went, and it was killed with Nate Saint and others on that island, that sandbar in Ecuador. And it made the front page of Life magazine, and it called a whole contacting an uncontacted tribe who didn't want to be contacted, so he could tell the good news of the gospel to them. And in just a few decades, so Jim Elliott was a hero. Like he was a secular hero. He was, like I say, he was on the front page of Life magazine, and led to a whole generation of people want to be missionaries. But then you compare the Jim Elliott, just to use one of the characters, the Jim Elliott moment to the John Chow moment. Very similar ideas. One's a villain, one's a hero. That's how much the world has changed towards missions. And what I said is in my world, we're still fools. We still believe that he is no fool who tries to hold on to his own life. And that was, of course, Jim Elliott's. And it's funny because it's actually, if you go and look, it's at the Wheaton College, at the Wheaton College archives. It says, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose," and that was a heroic phrase and a heroic life. But decades later, it's a villain, and I think that also impacts Christians. And what I would say is, I'm convinced that the world needs Jesus, that every tongue, tribe, and nation needs to hear the good news of the gospel. Now, I think it needs to be in missiologically appropriate ways. I'm not saying everything that, well, for that matter, I'm not saying everything Jim Elliott did was the way it would be done, but not everything John Chow did was the way we might do it if we thinking about these issues related to how to engage a people group. But at the end of the day, every people group needs to hear the good news of the gospel. That's fallen on hard times. I'm glad Urbana has not given up on that theme because, and as the student volunteer movement and then the student missions movement, most of those missions conferences that were around a century ago are all gone now, and the people at those schools don't hold those as being priorities anymore, if they even believe in the conversionary nature of the gospel.
Yeah, you and I've talked about this because Biola is still the only student-led missionary conference that still continues from that era,
which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And you led that student missions conference. So
I was a leader of the student missionary union, for several years.
So kind of a weird historic thing is that almost every college and university of any size, Christian or non-Christian, had like these student missionary unions. They're going to mobilize people for missions 100 years, maybe more than 100 years ago. And then, they kept forming and Biola eventually formed one. And it is interesting that now it's actually the largest annual student-led missions conference in the world, but it's also the oldest and only continuing student-led missions conference in from all that era. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So has missions fallen on hard times? You bet. The great century of mission probably ended in 1910. From late 1800s to 1910, and I just love to see a great century of missions return.
It's interesting. I was talking to a psychologist talking about the nature of young people being, stressed out, anxious, the mental health issues that have, kind of we talk about when that define a generation. And she was telling me, one thing that makes those things go away is when you're living on purpose, when you're living on mission. And it made me realize that there could be this gap in, living, we used to always say, I want something big enough to live for and something big enough to die for. And I don't know that sometimes we present Christianity in the world with that kind of breadth, that waking up every day and living on mission for Christ is big enough to live for and big enough to die for as well. if so called to do that. And I've sometimes wondered if there's a relationship between those things at all that we're seeing in the world, because waking up knowing what you have to do every day is kind of a cognitive behavioral therapy. But anyway, I thought it was an interesting insight from a counselor. It's above my pay grade to comment on, but that was something
I
that
would
was
I would
telling
want to
me.
put a lot of caveats and nuances in that sentence, but I
Sure.
would say that having something to live for is good for everybody's mental health. And I think ultimately, for me, as one who believes that Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection is the central event, the entire universe, to order your life around that truth and the mission he sends us on just makes a lot of sense and seems like a healthy decision.
Yeah, and I think what's important, because there are a lot of parents that actually don't want their kids to come to something like Urbana. They're afraid, hey, my son who's who's going to school to be a doctor or a lawyer is going to give all that up and start raising support or whatever. But as we look at the history of all of this, while some people do feel led and called to do that, it's really more about a whole world thinking differently about how we live on mission, because some people are scaffolding around that. Urbana is much more than just trying to get people to become missionaries. It's about literally living a globally Christian life, where you're understanding your place in this bigger picture of what God is doing, and that leads me to kind of a little bit of your
before you go off that, let me say
Yeah.
one phrase I heard once about this, and I think you're right. Most people who go to Urbana are going to just get a greater heart for God's global mission. But it was something that really convicted me once, that one of the greatest hindrances to the task of global mission sending is godly parents and grandparents who don't want their kids and grandkids to go somewhere else. And I get that. I got daughters, but I would rejoice if they were to say, we want to go to engage the POCOT in Africa. Simultaneously, it would be a hard thing. Now, here's the thing: keep in mind, the Great Century of Missions was from the late 1700s to the early 1900s. They didn't have FaceTime. They didn't have emails and texts, and then they would go and bring their coffins, and what I would say is our ability is still hard. Cross-cultural missionaries are sacrificing comforts of life and deep family connections and experiencing cross-cultural disruptions and more. And yet, what a joy it would be, and with all the technology we have, is opportunities that weren't there before. Sorry, you were going to draw on something else.
No. That's great. It is a different world, and the way that we live into this thing is really different. I mean, I always say, if you get dropped into a large city with a cell phone and a credit card, you can pretty much find your way around, even if you don't know the language or the culture. That wasn't always the case. Even just 20 years ago, when it came to international travel, it was much more challenging to be able to go and navigate those spaces. So the world has changed quite a bit in that regard, for sure. So churches are also not sending like they used to. This isn't just a parent problem; it's a church problem, and this kind of gets a little bit to some of what we want to talk about and some leadership you're going to be giving at Urbana. We were at Wheaton for an event, and Michelle Outwell was Send International, the president of Send International. She was talking to me about the fact that, if young people decide to come at Urbana, what she was concerned about is, do they have churches that will actually support them and send them and help them live into this life? And I have noticed that as I've gone to speak at churches and stuff, it used to be when I go into the lobby, you'd see the missionary boards, these are our missionaries and we're praying for these people. And I don't see that as much anymore, especially as churches get larger. What do you see in that regard? And, talk a little bit about what we want to try to do at Urbana to support pastors and other church leaders that are coming, trying to figure out what's our role in helping this generation connect with the Great Commission.
Yeah, I mean, it's the right question. I mean, and the challenge is that churches have become very focused on things that help them to thrive numerically. And what I would say is, and they often measure greatness by that. And I go to a very large church. I'm a teaching pastor at a very large church. I'm not mad at large churches. But what I would say is, I mean, it's almost cliche, but I think the greatness of a church shouldn't be measured by its seating capacity, but by its sending capacity. And, and I'm preparing a talk for the staff at Mariners Church where I'm teaching pastor on where multiplication fits in. Well, multiplication almost always happens outside of our local body. It's not about our kingdom, but about the kingdom of God multiplying all around the world. So I do think that we're going to have to see and elevate the passion for God's global mission among churches. And so part of what we're going to do with the pastor's track is seek to do just that. So, and it's not going to be
let me just break in there for a second, because you just made an announcement that I may not have set up real well.
Am I getting ahead of things? Sorry.
Well, Ed's going to be speaking, in general session, but he's also going to be curating a pastor's track that you're going to be leading and a church leaders track at Urbana. So I just want to make sure that we make sure everybody understands what you're saying there, because I want to make sure that they understand that. So,
no worries. So part of what we want to do is, I think a lot of pastors are trying to ask the question, if you were Assemblies of God 50 years ago, you had Royal Rangers and missions was sort of tied into those things. If you're Southern Baptist, you had RAs and GAs and whatever it may be. You had all these things. You're Wesleyan. You have programs for missions. And what happened is churches said, we can't do 5 things a week. And so they went down for these to have Sunday school and Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night and maybe missions, whatever. And so when it shrunk, the life of church basically become worship and small group. And then missions kind of got lost in that. Now there's some good stuff out there, like missions awareness classes, things of that sort, that have been helpful. But at the end of the day, we just don't have the local church engagement in global missions. And so I think you have to find, each church needs a champion for that, probably needs some sort of working group for something like that. And then, churches used to do these mission activities. Now they do mission trips. And what I would say, I'm not against mission trips. If it involves a ropes course, it's probably less of a missions trip and more of a vacation. So I think for us, and I don't want you to be mad at me if you have a ropes course. People can take a day off, but it needs to be primarily meeting the needs of the people that you're seeking to engage, showing and sharing love of Jesus to them. So what I would say is, some things we're going to talk about is how can your church continue to function as, in its gathered worship and in its small groups and the life and your discipleship. And how can you be global Christians? How can you think globally about God's work in the world? The Lord seems really focused on his desire to be worshiped by the tongues of every tongue, tribe, and nation, men and women of every tongue, tribe, and nation. So much so that you just follow the whole thread of it through the scripture. Like in Joel, they're going to go up to Jerusalem, the nations, or in Isaiah, they're going to go up to Jerusalem. And then, the people of God in the Old Testament aren't particularly faithful to the global mission. So then he miraculously shows what it looks like, what the nations would have been like in Acts chapter 2. Pentecost is what it would have looked like if the people of God in the Old Testament were obedient to bringing the nations up to Jerusalem, hearing tongues of the nations, and they don't. But then Jesus reverses the mission. It's no longer up to Jerusalem. Now it's out from Jerusalem, but to where? But Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, any uttermost parts of the earth. What happens in the uttermost parts of the earth? You reach people from every tongue, tribe, and nation. And then in Revelation, we see the beautiful vision of every tongue, tribe, and nation. So I think we need to care about the things God cares about, and God cares that he is worshiped in the tongues of many tongues, tribes, and nations. And if your church largely cares about its attendance and its budget, I think you're missing the bigger picture that it's not even that your church needs to find a mission. It's that God's mission has your church, and because God's mission has your church, you're focused on the things that he cares about as the scriptures describe.
Growing up, I had pastors that were very involved with us. Like if we went to summer camp, they would come along. They didn't stay always in the room with us, but they came with us. They were present in our lives as we were kind of maturing. And I remember after attending Urbana in 1990, my pastor saying, "Hey, I wanted to brief your experience at Urbana," and he was just involved. As we look at inviting pastors and other church leaders, because not every senior pastor can go, but there are other pastors within the church, other church leaders. What are some of the things you'd encourage them about coming to Urbana, bringing young people to Urbana, as we think about what we want to accomplish there?
Yeah, and I think ultimately there has to be, you go to a conference because of a sense of you have trust. Now, mind you, I plan conferences all the time, and there's always a speaker who I'm like, oh yeah, maybe that wasn't so great, and that's part of it. But one of the things that you can have trust in is, I mean, Matt, you got a heart for global missions. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. I have confidence with you planning Urbana, and the voices that you're inviting are going to be reflective of a focus on men and women showing and sharing the love of Jesus, living as on mission in every sphere of society, calling people to global cross-cultural missions, either themselves or supporting. Everyone can have a role, right? Some will give, some will pray, some will go. The old expression of missions is, you go and I'll hold the ropes. Someone will hold the ropes. And so what I would say is, you're going to set a broad table of ways to show and share the love of Jesus with diverse voices from around the world. I think that's key. It's God's global church. It's not from the West to the rest. The Urbana happens to be in Phoenix, which is in America. But at the end of the day, this is God's global mission, and to hear voices from around the world. I know you've got several voices from around the world. So, and the ultimate hope is that you'll get in that space, and in that space, something happens in spaces like that. This is why Urbana has this crazy history of people being transformed and engaged in God's global mission. And what I would say is, get in that space, and while in that space, back to that Hebrews passage, you'll be provoked to love and good deeds. So what I would say is, I've just got a great trust and enthusiasm that this is going to be a really transformative Urbana, not just because it's warm in Phoenix, but because ultimately it'll be a warm in people's hearts, because they're going to get excited about what it means to join Jesus on mission.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that have emerged, for college students to participate in. One of the things I really like about Urbana is the length of it. It's about a day or two longer than most things that young people go to these days. And I think there's something about that processing time that gives them a chance to really reflect, let it soak in, let their imagination kind of go wild. And, it's interesting, some research has been done on that original, the Mount Herman 100 that originally kind of launched the student volunteer movement back in 1886. And, about 20 of those 100 actually made it to another country, but the other 80 were really instrumental in kind of the infrastructure around sending and going. And so just want to encourage, pastors, church leaders that may be listening, college students. This is really about finding kind of how God sets the direction for your life. It's not necessarily about trying to get you overseas, but how you live into what God is doing globally. Ed, you're the liaison for Lausanne as for North America. Are you seeing any trends or anything like that also might just be helpful to leaders as they're thinking about Urbana and kind of how their church fits into what's going on missionally right now?
Well, if we're at kind of I don't know if it's an historic low, but we're in the ebb and flow of missions passion. I think we're on the low side of missions passion. I think that coming out of the Lausanne Global Congress, where you were and I was as well, and I think ultimately hearing, I think right now the current political environment is, how do, most of the attendees of Urbana will be Americans. How do Americans view the world right now? And here's what I would say. I think it's an opportunity for Christians to stand up, to show and share the love of Jesus, to stand in the gap and say, we believe that God so loved the world that he sent his one and only son. And so I think in the cultural moment, there's an opportunity for Christians to say, regardless of what people's politics are, that at the end of the day, God's on a global mission and we want to be a part of that. And we know that he loves people from every tongue, tribe, and nation. And that's going to be our passion and our focus. And because the world could do what the world does, and, countries can do what countries do, but the body of Christ does what the Savior says to do. And he says, go make disciples of all nations. And so that panta ta ethne in the Greek. Now, ethne isn't quite a direct line to like ethnic group. It comes from the same root word. But the apostles who heard that, the disciples who heard that, they would have heard Gentiles. They would have thought of the nations as the other peoples in the world. Well, the nations still need Jesus. And I'm looking forward to being in a place where a whole lot of people share a passion for the fact that I need Jesus, I need the gospel, and in the power of the Holy Spirit, my neighbor needs to hear the gospel shared by believers like me and like you, and ultimately the whole world needs to hear, because in doing so, the name and fame of Jesus is more widely known. So, man, I'm looking forward to being at Urbana. I mean, being back at Urbana. It's not my first time, but I'm looking forward to being back at Urbana and seeing what the Lord does in the lives of students, and in our case, for our track, pastors as well.
The path to adulthood has really changed a lot for 20 somethings. We see people getting married, starting families, really getting into their career a little bit later, late 20s, early 30s. It's very different than when you and I were in our 20s. And I've heard so many people talk about Urbana being a direction setting event. It's like an event that really helped people kind of chart a course and determine, kind of their next steps. Talk a little bit about the experience you and Donna had as you were younger, making this decision to really live into God's purpose, and some other insights that might be helpful to another young person who's maybe listening to this going, yeah, I'm trying to figure out, my adult life and where I'm going in my career. What advice would you give them from your own life experience?
Well, and my life experience might just be weird for a lot of people. So, we were college students. I had a degree in biology and chemistry, graduated, and we just felt this call to church planning. It wasn't Urbana, but there were these festivals that we had gathered together, these Christian music festivals, and I heard a speaker really put a call towards church planting, and it just kind of got a hold of me. And eventually, sort of,
that's a natural next step for a biology major, right?
Well, that's the thing, and that's what's weird. So I actually, there was this weird thing. So I went to college, majored in biology and chemistry, and was actually headed towards the Army and medical school. And what happened is I always had church planning on my mind, because I was at this music festival, and I remember the speaker, still remember the speaker. And kind of called people to be involved in church planning and missions. And it really stuck with me. But I thought, smart people don't go into church planning and missions. This is just transparently what I thought. And I should be a doctor. So I did biology and chemistry pre-med, went into the to the processing to get into the Army. You go to something called MEPS, Military Entry Processing Station, which is basically when you do your physical and all that sort of stuff. Well, they actually found that I had an eye scar tissue in my left eye that disqualified me from military service, and that was a real shocker. So that was my plan. I was going to go to the Army, I was going to cover medical school, all this sort of stuff, and so we kind of had this crisis in our maybe it was our junior year in college. And so Donna and I began to pray, and Donna said, I always thought God wanted you to be a pastor. And I was like, okay, well, I didn't. And, and so then but here I am finishing this biology and chemistry degree, but I went back to thinking about that speaker that really resonated with me, a call to church planting and missions. So we decided that we wanted to do that, step into church planting. And we wanted to go to a place that was often left out and left behind. So we went to the fastest shrinking city in America, Buffalo, New York, in the inner city, in the midst of the crack epidemic of the late 80s and early 90s. And went into a very bad neighborhood. Our parents were aghast. My father called Buffalo the armpit of New York, and we're just aghast. But so we now again, I applied to be a church planter. I wrote a letter to two organizations, one of which was where I heard the speaker at this festival, and said, I want to be a church planter. I hear you guys are in church planning. And another organization. Neither of them responded. So I applied to eventually my denomination. My denomination said, you're not qualified to be a church planter. Got a degree in biology and chemistry. I took 2 religion courses in college from a school that was moving away from any religion. It's a strong religion commitment. And so there I went. And so for us, so that's why I'm like, I'm not sure that I'm the best example, but I couldn't, being the center of God's will is the perfect place to be. And we were in the center of God's will. If I were speaking to, my daughters are now the age that Don and I were when we lived in Buffalo, and if I were talking to them, I would say to them that I want you to consider what it is God's call on your life. And if God's call on your life includes missions and missions service, or in my case, church planning, which is considered a form of missions by North American mission agencies, how do you need to prepare? I was not prepared when we got to the inner city of Buffalo, New York. I started doing seminary, and I started literally driving. This is one of the reasons I'm the dean of a seminary. I was living in Buffalo, driving 4 hours each weekend to sleep on the floor of an office building in a sleeping bag so I could do my seminary at a seminary extension center in Pittsburgh. So many more easy options today. to do that. But I had to learn. And so what I would say is, let's take some more time to prepare well. That might involve seminary, might not involve seminary. But then I would say, let's think about where you're going. Let's develop support systems. I didn't take the time to develop support systems. Now there's all kinds of resources to do that. And you go to places like Urbana, and you got to remember, you're going to meet some, InterVarsity staff members, and they're like, many of them raise their own support, and the world didn't burn down. But if you're 20 years old, it sounds like, how in the world could such a thing happen? And yet it happens every day. Like tens of thousands of missionaries do this. So what I would say is, I would have, let me just say, we did what the Lord called us to do. I would say, if I was giving advice to somebody, I would say, let's take the time to prepare, build support systems and structures, get the training you need, and then go into that situation. But again, I will tell you, I can right now rewire an electrical panel. My electrical panel is just over here to the left. I can rewire an electrical panel. I can replumb a house. I can hang sheetrock, and I can do all that because I became a church planter who couldn't get support from anybody else, and I got a job, and it was a great character building thing. And I love working with my hands still to this day. But again, my story is probably a weird story.
Well, I don't know. I mean, everybody's story is kind of unusual in terms of how we get where we're going. And I think,
True.
I think what I'm hearing you say is, we were just obedient to what God asked us to do in that moment, to the best of your ability. And, I do think that there's a lot of stuff in our early years. I mean, it seems today that this generation has like access to everything. They can produce things, they can create, make, distribute, publish, market. Everything can be done from a desktop, yet there's this experience that God knits inside of us as we actually do things, that shapes us. And I think for this generation, they think that they can figure it all out before they move. And sometimes you just got to move and get going. So that's great. Yeah. And there are lots of opportunities to prepare and figure out your way as well. I remember my dad, Ed, when I was wanting to leave Biola after my first year, because I was, the world needed Jesus right now, and I was going to leave school, go find a place to go share the gospel. And my dad was like, you ought to read this book, Bruchko. It might change your mind about it. And I read the book, and it was all about a guy who went down into the, uninhabited or very low inhabited areas in Colombia, and went through terrible experiences to share the gospel with these people. And I read it, and it only motivated me.
Yeah.
I told my dad, look, see, he's doing exactly what I was talking about doing. And so, but what's interesting through all that is that as I was preparing at Biola and having other leadership experiences along the way, God actually led me down a different path than what I originally thought. And so there is something interesting about just being in the place that God needs you to be today.
Good. I like that. And I think in some sense, it's like, what if you had said to me when I was 21 years old, moving into the inner city of Buffalo, New York, that I would be, the dean of the Talbot School of Theology, and now we have we've merged together for a stronger program, the Talbot School of Theology and the Cook School for Intercultural Studies, so we can have a sharper and stronger focus on missions throughout all of our programs. If you had said to me that I would be leading one of the leading missiological, we have PhD and MA, master's degrees, all in and around missions. We call it intercultural studies, because sometimes people need to cross borders with other countries that don't like the word missions and degrees. And if you had said to me that I'd be doing that now, I would have, for me, it's just a question of, let's be obedient to what the Lord has next. We were in Buffalo. We were there for 5 or 6 years. By the way, every year we lived in Buffalo except one. The Bills went all the way to the Super Bowl. Just wanted to point that out. I'm not saying there's a correlation to that, but we lived in Chicago. The Cubs won the World Series. So I'm not saying there's a correlation to that. But anyway, and I recognize the Bills never won the Super Bowl. But anyway, so when we were in Buffalo, then the Lord called us to Erie to plant another church, and and then before we were there, the Lord called us to plant two churches out of the church that we planted, and then, it's just trying to be obedient to the subsequent call that's there. I think that's what Urbana does. It puts you in a moment with others who love Jesus, who care about God's global mission. And then you can say, Lord, what's next? And is I just need to be more globally minded Christian? Almost certainly that's going to include that. Is there more that I need to do involved in, helping support missions work around the world? Is there more I can do in serving and showing the love of Jesus to my neighbor or to a marginalized community or something else? And it's just a question of what's next. Do to quote the Frozen 2, do the next right thing. I bet you didn't see a Frozen 2 quote coming in our podcast, but do the next right thing. Do the next thing the Lord leads you to do is what I would say.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, hey, thanks, Ed, for sharing with us today from your life. I learned things about you I didn't know. So we don't normally get a chance to like go into our histories when we're together. We usually have something we have to do. So it's kind of nice to be able to hear a little bit of that story and take away some things from it. Well, I hope that you'll all enjoy it. Join us at Urbana when we have this pastor's church leader gathering. If you're a student, participate in Urbana. If you're a church pastor, church leader, bring your young adults along with you. Go on this journey with them. And we have something special for you as well while you're there that will help enrich the life of your church and what you're doing.
Yeah, so let me say, we're going to be bringing a group from Biola, and we're going to be bringing a group from Mariners Church, and we're excited about being a part of Urbana. But do we say 2025, even though it ends in 2026? So you just say 2025?
I always do with the 2025. Yeah. So Urbana 25. Right. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Even though it ends 15 minutes into the new year.
Which I will just tell you, I'll be sleeping at that time because there is, maybe I'll stay up.
You got it. Maybe you stay up for this one. I think it's going to be fun. So yeah.
All right, I'll do it. I'll do it.
Phoenix. Yeah.
All right. I'll do
Great.
it.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
I am really excited that Dr. Stetzer is going to be curating that pastor church leader track. Phoebe, a lot of people don't know the role of Bible study at Urbana, which is different. It's not just listening to a speaker. You're doing it with students. That can be a little intimidating to some people, perhaps, but talk a little bit about that experience, because it's during that time that church leaders were like, hey, these student-led Bible studies, we don't have anything to do. And we were like, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to equip the church leaders and give them tools and resources to help them bring Urbana back to their congregations. So Dr. Stetzer is going to be doing that. But share just for a quick moment a little bit about the Bible study experience from a student perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as far as I know, I think Bible studies have been a part of Urbana for a long time, maybe as long as it's existed. But I think what I loved most about them was that they were peer-led, and it felt like a really comfortable space because I was with like-minded people, mostly in my same generation, and mine was led by a student who went to a different school than me. But we had, this leader, and some of us were older than her, and some of us were younger. And so we were kind of just on this equal playing field, which was really special for me to feel empowered in my own leadership as a freshman going to Urbana, who was seeing this upperclassman who was such a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ and just shepherded us through the conference in such a beautiful way. I think that was just really, really cool to see how she cared for us, and we were her sheep for the conference, and I was really inspired. I felt myself really looking up to her throughout the conference and thinking about how I, too, as a student, could take on more leadership roles and shepherd other people around me through experiences like Urbana. So she was really an inspiration to me, and I think because she was also a student, it made it ever more attainable and tangible for me to look up to a leader and really receive almost training from her example.
That's cool. Yeah. If you are a leader, pastor, church leader, campus leader, just know that there are opportunities for your students. If you have a couple leadership students in your group, you say, hey, I think they'd be great at leading a small group. We have lead experience signups at urbana.org that you can just kind of say, hey, we're interested in knowing about that. And there's some training that they'll go through to be able to do that. And they'll be able to actually serve at Urbana. But really want to encourage you to bring a group with you from your church if you're a pastor or a leader of a small group of young adults. All right. Well, hey, we will see you next time. Thanks, Phoebe, for joining me again. And we will see you next time on the Urbana podcast.